Xiamen, China, a place where the fragrance of incense fills the air and the sound of church bells echoes through the streets. A secret affair between a housewife and a Catholic priest set off a chain of events that destroyed everything in its path. As whispers spread and lives shattered, the question lingered: could love truly survive in the face of such devastating betrayal? Or would it leave behind nothing but ruin? In the small, quiet town of Xitang, nestled between the hills of eastern China, there lived a housewife named Mei Ling. Mei Ling had been married for nearly 15 years to Li Wei, a man who worked long hours in a factory, providing for his family but emotionally distant. Their life, while comfortable in the eyes of many, was marked by silence, routine, and an unspoken distance between husband and wife. Mei Ling, in her early 30s, was a woman with striking features. Her almond-shaped eyes, dark and deep, had once been full of youthful hope, but over the years they had grown weary, carrying the weight of unfulfilled desires. She was slender, with long black hair that cascaded down her back, often tied into a neat bun. Her movements were graceful, almost rehearsed, as though she were performing a role she had long since grown tired of. In the heart of this small town, where gossip was as common as the morning tea, Mei Ling's story was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. It was in the church that Mei Ling first met Father Shu, a Catholic priest who had recently been assigned to the local parish. Father Shu was a man in his early 40s, with a well-kept appearance that seemed to match his serene and composed demeanor. He stood tall, his posture always perfect, his black robe flowing elegantly behind him. His face was one that inspired immediate trust, with a strong jawline, dark eyes, and a gentle smile. There was a calmness to him that made him approachable, a stark contrast to the rigid and stern manner that many had expected from a man of the cloth. Father Zhu had been sent to Xitang to rebuild the dwindling congregation, and the people of the town, particularly the women, were drawn to him in ways they hadn't been to any of the previous priests. His sermons were compelling, and his presence had an undeniable allure. Mei Ling was no exception. Her first encounter with Father Shu had been on a rainy Sunday morning. She had gone to the church to pray, hoping for solace from her thoughts. Li Wei, as usual, was too tired to accompany her, leaving her to go alone. It was a moment of quiet reflection, or so she thought. Father Shu was standing near the altar, offering quiet words of comfort to the few parishioners who had gathered. Mei Ling had felt an odd sense of connection the moment she laid eyes on him. His gaze had met hers across the pews, and for an instant there was a spark. Something unspoken, but undeniable. She had been surprised by the sudden rush of warmth that enveloped her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, certainly not since the early days of her marriage. In the weeks that followed, Mei Ling began to attend Mass more frequently. She found herself sitting in the back row, watching Father Shu with a mix of curiosity and admiration. She was drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. He was kind and attentive, always ready with a word of encouragement or a comforting gesture. In him, she found someone who seemed to understand her in a way Li Wei never had. The distance between her and her husband had been growing for years, and the emotional void she felt was becoming unbearable. Father Shu, on the other hand, seemed to see her. He made her feel heard and valued in ways she had longed for. As time passed, their encounters became more frequent. Mei Ling found herself lingering after Mass, waiting for a moment to speak with Father Shu. Their conversations began innocently enough, discussing the sermon or offering prayers for her family. But over time, the conversations began to change. There was a new intimacy between them, one that was hard to define, but impossible to ignore. Mei Ling couldn't help but notice how his voice softened when he spoke to her, how his eyes would linger just a little longer than necessary. She had never experienced anything like it before, a gentle caress of words that stirred something deep inside her. Father Shu too had begun to notice Mei Ling in a way he hadn't with others. She was a woman of quiet strength, yet there was a sadness behind her smile that made him want to protect her. She confided in him her struggles, the loneliness, the neglect, the yearning for something more. He listened, and in his presence, Mei Ling felt safe. It was a feeling that had eluded her for so long. He was a man of God, yet there was something undeniably human in the way he responded to her pain. His words were soothing, his understanding deep, and his touch, though brief and accidental, seemed to spark something in her. She couldn't deny it anymore. The attraction was there, growing, quietly but steadily, like a secret that was too powerful to remain hidden. What started as a friendship, rooted in shared conversations and simple acts of kindness, soon evolved into something far more dangerous. It was an attraction that neither of them had planned for, but both had secretly nurtured. It was in the quiet moments, the fleeting touches as they exchanged books, or the prolonged eye contact during their private discussions, that the boundaries began to blur. Mei Ling, caught between her longing for connection and her loyalty to her marriage, struggled with the pull she felt toward Father Shu. She was fully aware of the consequences of her actions, yet the more she resisted, the stronger the attraction became. Father Shu, too, was torn between his vows and the undeniable chemistry he shared with Mei Ling, but his sense of duty, his commitment to his faith, was beginning to wane, replaced by a deeper, more dangerous desire. It was on a humid summer evening, when the church was empty and the air was thick with tension, that Mei Ling and Father Shu's relationship took its fateful turn. They were alone in the church after the evening service, the only sound being the soft echo of their footsteps on the stone floors. Mei Ling had lingered, waiting for the priest to finish his duties. Father Shu, noticing her presence, had asked if she would like to stay for a private prayer. What followed was a moment that neither of them had anticipated. The prayer was long and intimate, their voices intertwining in the stillness of the room. In that sacred space, with the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls, something inside Mei Ling shifted. She reached out, her hand brushing his, and the moment stretched out, suspended in time. Father Shu didn't pull away. Instead, he took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch sending a shiver through her. It was a dangerous crossing of boundaries, but neither of them could turn back. From that point on, their encounters grew more frequent, more intense. What began as stolen glances and whispered words turned into secret meetings, hidden away from the prying eyes of the congregation. The small town of Zizang, where everyone knew each other's business, became the perfect setting for their illicit affair. They met in the church after hours, in dark corners of the garden, and in quiet alleyways. They kept their secret well, each meeting filled with a mix of fear and desire. But as the days passed, the stakes grew higher. Neither Mei Ling nor Father Shu could foresee just how deadly their affair would ultimately become. As the secret relationship between Mei Ling and Father Shu deepened, the atmosphere in Zizang began to change. The town, once known for its tranquility and close-knit community, now buzzed with an unspoken tension. The church, where people had once sought solace, began to feel suffocating. Father Shu, who had been a symbol of piety and serenity, was now haunted by his own choices. His commitment to the vows he had taken seemed increasingly irrelevant, overshadowed by the intensity of his emotions for Mei Ling. Mei Ling, too, was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting desires. On one hand, there was the security of her marriage with Li Wei, the predictable and stable life she had known for over a decade. On the other, there was Father Shu, whose presence filled a void she hadn't even realized existed. The guilt that weighed heavily on her chest had become unbearable, but the allure of the forbidden was even more powerful. Her days became a blur of tension and deceit. Li Wei, ever the workhorse, was unaware of the growing distance between them. He was focused on his job, working tirelessly to provide for their family. Mei Ling, on the other hand, spent her evenings at the church, her heart torn in two. She loved her husband in her own way, but the emotional void she had lived with for so long had only deepened over time. Father Shu had filled that emptiness, but in doing so, he had created a new kind of chaos in her life. It wasn't long before Mei Ling's behavior began to change. She was more restless at home, distracted during meals, and distant in her conversations with Li Wei. Her once warm and welcoming nature had turned cold, as though she were carrying a heavy burden she couldn't shake. Li Wei noticed the change, but he dismissed it as a result of her stress. After all, she was a housewife with little to occupy her time outside of managing the home. He never suspected the affair that had taken root in their lives, one that threatened to destroy everything they had built together. Mei Ling's guilt was suffocating, but the attraction to Father Xu was undeniable. It became harder for her to resist the pull of their secret meetings, where every stolen moment felt like both an act of betrayal and a rush of forbidden excitement. In the evenings, when Li Wei came home exhausted from his long hours at the factory, Mei Ling would retreat into her thoughts, imagining the tender touch of Father Xu's hand or the warmth of his gaze. Each time they met, the connection grew stronger, more intense. They spoke less in words and more in gestures, their silences saying more than anything they could have verbalized. Mei Ling's mind, once occupied with the mundane tasks of daily life, now raced with thoughts of their next encounter. Father Xu, too, was becoming consumed by the affair. His usual calm, composed nature was slipping away, replaced by a hunger he hadn't anticipated. He began to doubt his own calling, questioning whether he had ever truly been committed to his faith or if it was merely a role he had been playing for years. His passion for Mei Ling overshadowed the moral foundation that had once guided him, and the guilt he felt was now something he tried to suppress rather than confront. Their encounters became more daring as the weeks went on. One rainy afternoon, when the church was nearly empty, Father Xu invited Mei Ling to meet him in the sacristy. The heavy rain outside had created a quiet, almost eerie atmosphere inside the church. The only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the soft patter of raindrops on the stained glass windows. In the dim light of the sacristy, surrounded by the scent of incense and the faint echo of distant prayers, Mei Ling felt her heart race. Father Xu stood in front of her, his usual calm expression replaced with something darker, more urgent. He reached out to her, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on her shoulders. The moment they touched, a spark ignited between them. In the confined space of the sacristy, they shared a kiss. Soft at first, tentative, but quickly deepening into something far more desperate. Stay tuned for more interesting and chilling documentaries by subscribing to this channel. It was a moment that neither of them would ever forget, the physical manifestation of their hidden desires. Mei Ling felt both exhilarated and terrified, caught in a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. Father Xu, too, was consumed by the intensity of the moment. He pulled her closer, his hands exploring her with an urgency that surprised them both. They were lost in each other, caught in a spiral of passion and guilt, when the sound of footsteps outside the sacristy door brought them back to reality. Mei Ling quickly pulled away, her breath shallow and panicked. Father Xu stood frozen, his face a mixture of regret and longing. They knew then that they could no longer keep their affair hidden. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but neither of them was willing to stop. The secret had become too powerful, too all-consuming. Mei Ling found herself sneaking away from home more frequently, using excuses to justify her absences. Li Wei grew more suspicious, but he never confronted her directly. He was too busy with his own struggles, too absorbed in his work, to question the distance growing between him and his wife. Father Xu, too, was struggling. He had been a man of faith, a servant of God, but now, standing on the precipice of his own moral downfall, he questioned everything he had ever believed in. He could no longer reconcile his desire for Mei Ling with the vows he had taken. His once steady faith had been shaken to its core, and he began to fear what his actions would mean for both his own soul and the life he had built in Xitang. As the days wore on, their affair grew riskier. They began meeting in increasingly secluded spots, away from the watchful eyes of the townspeople. But even in their secret encounters, there was a sense of inevitability, as though the web they had woven around themselves was tightening, and escape was no longer an option. Mei Ling's guilt continued to eat away at her, but she couldn't stop herself. Father Xu, too, was trapped in a world of his own making. Their secret affair, once a small spark, had now become a raging fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. The toll their secret affair had taken on both Mei Ling and Father Xu was becoming undeniable. Despite the palpable tension that clung to them every time they shared a fleeting moment of intimacy, neither of them could bring themselves to end it. Father Xu's internal turmoil deepened each day, as the conflict between his faith and his desires began to erode his very sense of self. He had once been a man of unwavering conviction, trusted by his community, but now he felt as though he was unraveling. The whispers of doubt that had been creeping into his thoughts grew louder with each passing day. His once calm demeanor had been replaced by an almost frantic energy. When he wasn't with Mei Ling, he was haunted by a suffocating guilt. How could he continue to lead his congregation while carrying such a shameful secret? For Mei Ling, the weight of her actions had begun to chip away at her outwardly serene appearance. At first, the affair had been a thrilling escape, a breath of excitement she had longed for in her predictable life. But as time wore on, the consequences of her choices became impossible to ignore. The guilt, once a quiet whisper, now screamed in her head, drowning out everything else. She found herself looking at Li Wei with increasingly distant eyes. The man she had married, the man who had provided for her and their family, but someone whom she no longer recognized. It wasn't just that she had betrayed him, it was that she had betrayed herself. Every stolen glance, every secret kiss with Father Zhu had cost her a piece of who she once was. Mei Ling's restlessness reached a boiling point. She no longer had the energy to pretend, to wear the mask of the dutiful wife in front of Li Wei. Her once warm and affectionate nature had grown cold, and her mind was always elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Father Shu. The guilt gnawed at her, leaving a deep sense of emptiness in its wake. She tried to convince herself that she was still a good wife, that she could still love Li Wei even if she had fallen into the arms of another. But she couldn't lie to herself anymore. The walls she had built around her emotions were crumbling, and the truth of what she had done was now impossible to ignore. Li Wei began to notice her increasing absence. He had always trusted Mei Ling, always believed in the strength of their marriage, but now something was different. She had become withdrawn, her eyes distant, her responses quick and dismissive. He tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the stress of managing the household while he worked long hours. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more the unsettling feeling in his gut grew. Mei Ling had changed, and though he couldn't pinpoint why, he knew deep down that something was amiss. One evening, when Li Wei returned home earlier than usual, he found Mei Ling sitting alone at the kitchen table. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling slightly as she absent-mindedly stirred a cup of tea. Her usual warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, distant demeanor that seemed almost foreign to him. She didn't notice him at first, and when she finally looked up, the sadness in her eyes was overwhelming. For a moment, Li Wei stood at the doorway, unsure of what to say. He had always prided himself on his ability to understand Mei Ling, to read her moods and anticipate her needs. But now, all he saw was a woman who seemed like a stranger. She smiled faintly, but it lacked the genuine warmth it once carried. The smile of a woman who had long buried her emotions beneath layers of lies. He sat down across from her, his gaze searching her face for any sign of the woman he had married. "Mei Ling," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. "Are you all right?" She nodded quickly, but the movement was stiff, robotic. She wasn't sure why she was even pretending anymore. She had spent so many months trying to keep up the facade, but it was exhausting. The weight of her own lies was starting to suffocate her, and she knew that it wouldn't be long before the truth would come spilling out. She had been living a double life for so long that it felt like everything she had built had become an illusion. She had deceived not only Li Wei, but herself as well. Meanwhile, Father Shu was battling his own demons. His public persona as a revered priest was beginning to crack. He could no longer walk into the church or stand before his congregation without feeling the oppressive weight of his secret. He had been teaching others about righteousness, about living a life of faith and purity, yet his own actions stood in stark contrast to everything he preached. The irony was suffocating, and the more he tried to bury his feelings for Mei Ling, the more intense they became. He found himself losing his grip on the very foundation of his faith. One Sunday morning, as Father Shu stood at the altar delivering his sermon, he found himself unable to focus. His mind wandered constantly, his thoughts consumed by Mei Ling, by the affair that had taken over his life. The words that came out of his mouth felt hollow, rehearsed. The congregation listened intently, their eyes fixed on him, but inside, Father Shu was unraveling. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and it was no longer something he could ignore. He had become a stranger to himself. What had once been a life of purpose and devotion had become a tangled mess of lies, and betrayal. The turning point came when Mei Ling and Father Xu met one final time. It had been weeks since their last encounter, and the tension between them was unbearable. They both knew that the affair couldn't continue any longer. The consequences of their actions had already begun to unravel their lives, and neither could ignore the inevitable. Mei Ling, torn between the life she had built with Li Wei and the passion she felt for Father Zhu, found herself standing on the precipice of an impossible choice. Father Zhu, his faith shattered and his soul consumed by guilt, knew that he couldn't go on living this lie. They met at the church, in the quiet, empty space where they had first found solace in each other's arms. It was the place where their affair had begun, but now it was the place where it would end. The air was heavy with tension, both of them knowing that their time together was running out. The truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. They were trapped in a web of their own making, and no amount of desire could untangle it. In that final meeting, words were unnecessary. The silence between them spoke louder than anything they could have said. They knew that their affair had left its mark on both of them, and the consequences of their actions were inevitable. Father Xu was a man of the cloth, and Mei Ling was a wife. Roles they could never fully escape, no matter how desperately they tried to. Their passion had been fleeting, a brief moment of rebellion against the lives they had chosen. But now, it was a dead end. The walls were closing in on them, and neither of them knew how much longer they could keep the truth buried. As the days passed, the tension between Mei Ling and Father Xu deepened. The final meeting at the church had been a turning point. It was no longer just a secret affair, it had become a destructive force in both their lives. The weight of guilt was unbearable, and neither of them could continue to live under the crushing burden of deceit. Mei Ling had long known that her world would collapse, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly the pieces would fall apart. Back at home, Li Wei's suspicion grew, despite his attempt to hold on to normalcy. His every glance at Mei Ling felt like he was seeing a stranger. She had become a shadow of the woman he had once loved. Every day, the strain in their relationship became more palpable. He had noticed the odd little details. The way she had withdrawn from their life, the way she kept to herself, the hours she spent alone, always with her phone in hand, sometimes leaving the house without explanation. But it wasn't just her behavior that troubled him. It was the hollow look in her eyes, the exhaustion in her every step. He could no longer ignore that something was amiss. One evening, as Li Wei returned from work earlier than usual, he found Mei Ling in the garden, sitting in the same spot where they had once shared laughter and dreams of a future together. It was ironic how things had changed, how time had taken its toll on their relationship. He stood at the door for a moment, watching her, trying to figure out how to ask the questions that had been eating away at him. The serenity of the moment felt strange, like a calm before a storm. When Mei Ling saw him standing there, she didn't react immediately. It was as though she had already anticipated his arrival, already bracing herself for the confrontation that she knew was inevitable. Slowly, she stood and walked toward him, her gaze downcast. "Li Wei," she said quietly, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. She wasn't sure what to say anymore. What could she say? The truth? She wasn't ready for that, not yet. But how long could she keep pretending? How long could she keep running from the inevitable? Li Wei's voice was low, almost a whisper as he spoke. "What's going on, Mei Ling? I can feel that something has changed. You're not the same person I married." Her heart tightened at his words. She wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but the guilt was overwhelming. She wanted to tell him everything, about the affair, about Father Xu, but she couldn't. It felt impossible to confess. Her entire life had been a lie, and she was unsure how to dismantle it without tearing everything apart. The longer she waited, the more the silence grew between them. She couldn't escape the suffocating weight of her own conscience. "I'm just tired," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the excuse she had given him countless times before, but today it felt hollow. She could see the skepticism in his eyes. He knew it wasn't just exhaustion. But before Li Wei could press her further, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was one of the local parishioners who had come to speak with Father Xu about a church matter. The interruption, though unintended, provided a brief respite from the mounting tension between Mei Ling and Li Wei. As Li Wei went inside to take the call, Mei Ling felt a sense of dread fill the space around her. That night, as Mei Ling lay awake in bed, her thoughts were consumed with the upcoming, inevitable confrontation. She could no longer escape it. Father Shu's face haunted her thoughts. She had grown distant from him too, knowing that their paths had diverged in a way that could never be undone. The affair had burned bright and intense, but like all fire, it was now slowly burning out. She had nothing left to hold on to. No more fleeting moments of passion, no more fleeting kisses. Father Shu had already started pulling away, sensing that the end was near. He had withdrawn from her, becoming cold and distant. There was no point in continuing, no point in pretending. Father Shu's life had also begun to unravel. As the months passed, his standing within the church grew more precarious. Whispers spread about his behavior. His once admirers started to notice his increasing erraticism, his inability to focus during Mass, the way his sermons lacked depth. The guilt of what he had done with Mei Ling now weighed him down so much that he was hardly able to maintain the composure of his position. His relationship with the congregation had grown strained, and many of the faithful had begun to question his authority. The trust that he had once commanded had begun to crumble. It was only a matter of time before the rumors began to surface. The people of the village, with their small-town sensibilities, had long suspected that something was wrong. Mei Ling's odd behavior had not gone unnoticed, nor had Father Zhu's increasing disappearance. They whispered about them in hushed tones, as whispers often grow into accusations. It didn't take long before someone put the pieces together. The affair had not gone unnoticed. It was only a matter of time before someone spoke up. Then, one fateful day, the truth came out. Li Wei had overheard a conversation in town, one that made his stomach drop. Mei Ling had been seen leaving the church with Father Shu on several occasions, their behavior far too intimate for a man of the cloth and a married woman. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. His entire world came crashing down in that moment. Confronting Mei Ling was the only option. As he stood in front of her, the tears in his eyes were not of sorrow, but of rage. His voice shook with emotion as he demanded the truth. Mei Ling, unable to hold the facade together any longer, finally confessed. She admitted everything. Her affair with Father Zhu, the lies, the betrayals. She told him about the months of passion and guilt, the stolen moments in the church, the secret meetings, and as she spoke, Li Wei could feel his world disintegrating around him. The betrayal was too much to bear. In the following days, the scandal exploded. Father Shu was confronted by the church, and his resignation came swiftly. The church no longer wanted anything to do with him. His once proud position had been shattered, and the once revered priest became an outcast. Mei Ling too found herself ostracized by her community, her betrayal hanging over her like an inescapable shadow. The damage was done. Their lives, once intertwined in secrecy and desire, had now come to an end. The affair had cost them everything. Mei Ling and Li Wei's marriage was irrevocably broken. The trust that had once held them together was shattered beyond repair. No amount of apologies could undo the pain that Mei Ling had caused. And as for Father Shu, he vanished from the public eye, never to be heard from again. His life had been consumed by his own hypocrisy, his own failures. What was once a passionate affair had turned into a deadly game of deception and destruction, one that had ruined the lives of all involved. In the end, the consequences of their actions were clear. Secrets, no matter how well hidden, have a way of surfacing. And the truth, however painful, will always find its way to the light. What happens when the line between faith and forbidden desire blurs? Subscribe now and be the first to uncover the truth behind the most spine-chilling stories you won't find anywhere else. Don't miss out, join the journey, and see where it all leads.